Well, friends, despite what it says on the bottom right corner, maybe one of a few things that I neglected to edit before this began. Welcome to the Monday, February 28th, 2022. I must have got that wrong even last month. Oh my gosh. Bird Study Group meeting as hosted by the Hamilton Naturalist Club. My name is Jackson Hudecki, and I'm the Bird Study Group Director for the HNC. And I'm excited to have you here tonight for a wonderful talk. As always, before we begin, I usually like to begin recognizing which land we're on, which is the traditional territories of the Haudenosaunee, the Anishinaabe, and the Huron-Wendat nations. The Hamilton Study Area, our 40-kilometer radius, we've got property within and outside of that 40-kilometer radius there, but we recognize the long history of First Nations and Indigenous and Métis people in the province of Ontario. We pay respects to the Six Nations of the Grand River Territory and the Mississaugas of the Credit, the holder of the treaty with the Crown for the lands we steward. We've been hearing a lot about Indigenous people, especially lately, especially in the last couple of weeks, especially in the last week or so. We know what is happening overseas, where it seems that one country is trying to take over another. And a lot of folks look around and it's easy to look at one situation and talk about that, but when you look at the whole world and we look at what's happened right here in North America, we know that there are still struggles occurring even today. So I'll talk a bit more about that in a second as well, but in case this is your first time joining us, this is our virtual offering of this program, which has been great for us that we've been able to connect with experts across the nation. Even from tonight, we'll be hearing from someone from the US of A. And I usually give a couple of announcements before leading into our special guest. And at any time tonight, use the chat, use the Q&A function. We'd love to hear from you. We'd love to know what's going on in your world. This is a spot where we like to bring any birder together, no matter where you are on the beginner or expert level. We just love having you here and just to talk about what's happening in the bird community. To birds, to birders, to science, you name it. We're one giant community. We are here all observing this planet. There are a multitude of expertise occurring around, and we love to celebrate anyone who is also celebrating nature. It is Black History Month. It is the last day of Black History Month, and I thought to mention a couple things tonight. And in thinking about diversity and thinking about the Naturalist Club specifically, we'd love to ensure that we're creating a safe space for, again, anyone who is immersing themselves in nature. And I saw this written tonight in an article written by Dr. Roger Lederer, according to the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. This is in 2011. This is some older data. 93% of American birders were white, 5% Hispanic, 4% were Black, 1% were Asian American, and 2% were other. Christian Cooper here on the right was harassed in Central Park when he asked someone to leash their dog. And it led to a very important movement called Black Birders Week. And I thought to just mention a couple of things tonight, specifically some Black-owned and operated pages and accounts for folks to check out. Because there are some amazing pages out there, including Color the Trails, which is a community for BIPOC and allies interested in the outdoors. And this is throughout North America, which is great. So it just provides it provides opportunities and shows the different avenues in which folks could be engaging with nature. Locally, Misha Dennis, who founded the Brown Girls Outdoor World, both social media and website pages, is also connected to kaleidoscopenature.ca, So a place to created a space for Black, Indigenous, and people of color to just enjoy and celebrate the outdoors, whether you're an enthusiast or you're a professional in the field. They aim to showcase the diversity of those in the Canadian outdoors, from scientists to outdoor recreationists. So another great place to check out, kaleidoscopenature.ca. I've been keen on finding and filming birds lately, and I was researching what wildlife filmmakers are out there, and I came across Julian Victor, who is working for Breakfast Television right now, but has a really cool Instagram page at JV_wild. Shay Smith, who you've heard me talk about before, who may even be in this chat in this night tonight, is a local-ish birder. The Mississauga, Caledon area, Vaughan area, suburberder. You could check Shay out. Shay's provided an image for me. I forget what it was. I forget which bird it was a couple months ago. But I reached out to Shay and he sent me a good photo. Maybe it was I think it was a warbler. I think it was, oh, it's escaping me now. It's been quite a week. But Shay's got some great images, and you can check Shay out at Suburberder. And there's a great shot of a greater scop here, but Shay's got some pretty amazing content on his page. So definitely check Shay out. But Blackbirders Week is something that is, I haven't seen much about it coming up in 2022, and maybe it usually happens at the end of May, early June. But that's something that was created by a lot of Blackbirders in the States. Karina Newsom helped found Blackbirders Week, and it's a great hashtag for it. But so you can click it to look for more information on that. But there, in that week, there are different talks that occur throughout the day. Different opportunities for folks to hear from other Blackbirders, and again showcasing some pretty incredible talent out there. And so this was taken from scienceworld.ca story, Why Representation in Nature Matters. So, so happy last day of Black History Month, and happy last day of, I guess, winter listing. Need to correct the math in that slide big time. I know, like I said, that was from 2011. So that was a very old fact sheet there. But you're right. And it's, so yeah, the last day of winter listing, and tomorrow starts day one of hawk watching, which is exciting. So I know a lot of folks who are getting down on winter start looking forward to spring when they know that the hawk watch begins. Birding activity in the HSA. So I've only heard a couple reports of red-winged blackbirds, grackles. There's only been, I think, 2 loose reports of killdeer coming through. But since our last meeting back in January, there's been a few cool sightings. So the tufted duck crossed with the lesser scaup, so a hybrid, was kicking around for a little bit. I've got a picture here of a fish crow, as photographed by Reuven Martin, who on an advanced birding page for Ontario had a video of a fish crow giving a pretty solid American crow's call, and then mixing in the fish crow call every 4th or 5th time it gave an American crow call, which is pretty interesting. So I've only been hearing of in the last couple of days, last week or so, about fish crow, so that's cool. Harlequin duck, pine grosbeak was around for a couple weeks, I'd say, out in the Dundas area, which was cool. Boreal owl, something that I was able to witness today. So that's been kicking around since, like December 31st, January 1st. So if you're going to check that bird out, make sure to give it lots of space. There was quite a few birders down there today. So we saw perhaps what happened to the short-eared owl in Toronto. We want to make sure that we're, keeping things safe while we're out there birding, creating a safe community for everybody, and also especially for the birds. So if you do go down and check that out, short and sweet, take a look, get a couple photos, keep your distance, and then check out what else is around there. We know a red-shouldered hawk was hanging around the Flamborough area for a little bit. People have been going bonkers for a tufted titmouse out on the Brawny Bluffs. Today, while down checking out the boreal owl, a flock of about 50 common redpoll showed up, and that was the first of the year for me to see a common redpoll, which was pretty cool. We know the Harris's sparrow is continuing, so that's been pushing through all winter long, which is pretty incredible. So what have you been seeing? Let us know in the chat. What have you been seeing in the last month? What's a good winter bird for you? We'd love to know. Jen Baker let me know that we're hoping to, as part of the Naturalist Club, conduct a couple bio blitzes, trying to bring some awareness to what's occurring in our nature sanctuaries. So starting May 7th, we're looking for some volunteers. There's going to be some more information on this on our website, hamiltonnature.org/bioblitz. I'd love to share that the HNC is going to be having a whole website revamp coming up in the next several months. So you can look forward to no longer 2-year-old outdated website. We're going to spruce the whole thing up, and that's for a lot of information. You'll be hearing a lot about this in the next couple months. Are these bio blitzes occurring at our sanctuaries? Just trying to highlight the biodiversity that we have on our various HNC properties. So registration is required through Eventbrite. You can contact Jen, land@hamiltonnature.org, for more information. And this is through our several properties. So there's going to be an initial virtual Zoom session held on April 5th from 7 until 8. So we're looking for some leaders through these properties. So a neat opportunity for folks to engage with the Naturalist Club spaces, to use your expertise, and to highlight to the community a little bit what's going on. Yellow-bellied sapsucker and the red-shouldered hawk in Brampton. Shay, there we go. Thanks for that. What happened to the owl at Downsview Park? Dina asks. Last I heard about a short-eared owl, just to go back there for a second, was that it was found on the ground for several hours, and the Toronto Wildlife Service came and collected the short-eared owl, and that's kind of the last I've heard of it. But I also haven't dug too deep as to what's going on with it, but there were quite a few people there for quite a while. So I think that's as much as I know about it, and if anyone knows more, feel free to add that in the chat. All right, so cool opportunity in May and June to help us conduct some bio blitzes. Let's put our brains and efforts to good use and showcase the biodiversity occurring around here. Now, I don't know enough about this. Admittedly, I've just been kind of warned that the avian flu is going to be something that we're going to be hearing more of in the next couple of months, and that if you encounter a sick bird, to not handle it yourself. These are signs of a sick bird: nervousness, tremors, lack of coordination, swelling of the neck, eyes, and head, lack of energy, coughing, gasping, or sneezing bird. If you see something suddenly die, these are some things for us to be looking out for. Not great news, of course, but something definitely to consider is being aware of what's occurring with the avian flu. I lifted this from a government website, so there is more information about that, and hopefully by the next meeting I'll be able to share a little bit more of what to look for. But I know that Chantel from the Hobbitstee Wildlife Refuge was just ensuring that people maybe keep their ears out a little bit for the avian flu and look for signs of it occurring in nature. But she's definitely concerned about it. If you are looking to get more active in the Hamilton birding community, you're at a great spot tonight with the Bird Study Group meeting, as hosted by the Hamilton Naturalist Club. So you can find the HNC across the social media channels. Aunt Birds and the OFO are doing great work. There are listservs occurring for Hamilton birds, for beginner birds, for the pipits. And on Discord is where a lot of information is being shared, especially on sightings. So you can check out Aunt Birds or the Hamilton National Club on Discord. We'd love for you to become a member of the Hamilton Naturalist Club. That helps keep things going for us. always looking for volunteers, always looking for help. But regardless, just being a member goes a long way. So we'd love to have you with the HNC. You can reach out to me anytime, birdstudygroup@hamiltonnature.org. Check out our website. You can send me a message tonight. You can just send me a direct message in the chat if you would like. But anytime, reach out to me. We're always looking to chat with folks. Our next monthly general meeting, so while the HNC conducts 2 virtual meetings a month, the bird study group meeting and the general meeting. So that's occurring next Monday with Adam Schultz, who's going to be talking to us about exploring Canada's wilds. So be sure to tune in to that. It's going to be a great talk. Adam spoke to us a couple years ago and always has some great things to say. I threw this in before our next month's talk because we're getting closer to picking a city bird. And this is where we want, there's 80 people here tonight. There's 80 people watching this presentation. We want you to go and pick what you think should be the bird that represents either the city of Hamilton or the city of Burlington. And this is the short list. So for a good while, there was an open nomination. You could nominate any native bird, and that was shortlisted down to who you see here. So we're going to then take whoever has the most votes, and that will be then the city bird for the city of Hamilton or the city of Burlington. We're looking for status from Nature Canada to approve both municipalities as bird-friendly cities based on a whole bunch of criteria. And through that, a city bird challenge was something that we thought that would help kind of get people thinking about what bird do you think represents this region? And you can see a whole bunch on there. Cormorant, mourning dove, mockingbird, killdeer, cardinal, chimney swift. I'm not sure what swan that is. Oh, I see the yellow tags are on the trumpeter swan. Red-tailed hawk, peregrine falcon, eastern bluebird, bald eagle, turkey vulture, Carolina wren, great blue heron, black-capped chickadee. I'll leave this up there. You can even scan that barcode right now with your camera. Turn your camera forward and you should be able to scan that barcode and it should take you right to the WordPress website, the Bird Friendly Hamilton Burlington WordPress page, and you can vote right there. So I will speak a second slower so you can scan that QR code. Voting closes soon. Voting closes on March 6th. So this was my last effort to get people to vote on a bird. And that being said, our talk next month is going to be from the Bird Friendly Cities team. Barry Coombs is going to talk to us a little bit about, and our very first bird study group meeting was with Ali Haider Ali from Nature Canada talking about the Bird Friendly Cities campaign. Since then, a coalition has been formed by several active volunteers and community groups to try and get Hamilton and Burlington certified as bird-friendly cities. Barry Coombs is going to talk to us all about what that means, what's been going on. So yeah, please come to that meeting on March 21st at 7:30 p.m. Okay, enough rambling from me. 7:48. Peter, I told you I'd get us there by 10 to 8. So to introduce our speaker tonight, I'm going to call upon a friend of mine, Peter Tome, to share some words about our special guest.
Well, thank you, Jackson. And boy, he leaves you breathless, didn't he? And talking about breathless, did you draw breath in that 20 minutes? I don't know. That was a ton of information. Anyway, that's not what I'm here to do. So I got to tell you that I'm going to take the credit for this. It was my idea to invite Scott Weidensaul as our speaker tonight. I'm absolutely delighted that Scott agreed. And I got to say, it's a real privilege for me to introduce Scott. And tonight we're going to have a convergence of 3 sort of storylines that I think you're going to enjoy. I think the first one is that, to me, snowy owls are always a story in themselves, even if you just see, the first one of the winter. But they're just always so magnificent and they're just so captivating. They're captivating to us as birders, and of course they're a big deal in fiction too. Just think of Hedwig in Harry Potter. That's the first point. The second thing is, I think Scott's going to tell you the story about Project SNOWstorm, and that is what, to me, one of the greatest stories that has unfolded featuring snowy owls and birding in the last half a dozen years. And the third point is, I know that Scott is a great storyteller. And I know that because I guess it was 99 or 2000 that I read his book, Living on the Wind, and it really is a great read. Scott is not only writes very knowledgeably about migration, but he writes beautifully. So from Pennsylvania, Scott Weidensaul, welcome and take it away.
Well, thank you very much, Peter. Although I have to say, actually, I'm not in Pennsylvania anymore. For the last 3 years, my wife and I have been living in New Hampshire. She now works for Massachusetts Audubon, so I'm learning to be a hardy New Englander. But it's a real pleasure to be with everyone this evening. I'm a little bit nervous because while I was waiting for the meeting to start, my laptop crashed and then rebooted itself and came back to life again. And it's never done that before. So anybody who's even vaguely superstitious, keep your fingers crossed, and we'll hope that everything goes smoothly this evening. But it's a pleasure to be with you all. I know some familiar names and some friends in the participants this evening, and I'm sorry that we're not all together in person, but that is, that's the way it is now in this pandemic world. Hopefully we're moving out of that now. And but the one good thing about the pandemic was it showed us that we could get together virtually like this. And I would not have otherwise probably had the opportunity to talk to the Hamilton Nature Club, the bird study group this evening. So I'm going to give you something a little better to look at than me. So bear with me for a moment here while I do the screen share two-step, which is always a little awkward. And with luck, you are seeing a title slide right now. If not, perhaps Peter or Jackson can let me know.
You're good.
Okay, fantastic. And there was much rejoicing. So I've been messing around with raptors all my life. I grew up and lived almost my entire life in eastern Pennsylvania, which is why Peter thought I was still down there. I grew up very close to Hawk Mountain. Got hooked on raptors when I was about 12 years old. My first trip to Hawk Mountain, spent much of the last 35 or 40 years doing raptor banding, starting with diurnal raptors like this Swainson's hawk down in South Texas that I trapped one day with Bill Clark. But then working my way into passerines and eventually, working a lot with hummingbirds over the years. I've been banding winter hummingbirds in the East here for about the last 20 years or so. But frankly, for most of the last quarter century or so, if you had put a gun to my head and asked me to pick my favorite bird, it would have been northern saw-whet owl. I've been involved since the late 1990s with a large saw-whet owl banding project through the Ned Smith Center for Nature and Art in eastern Pennsylvania. We've banded about 12,000 saw-whets over the years. I mean, how can you not love that face? How can you not be charmed by that little bird? So that was always my favorite bird. And then I cheated because, oh baby, you take a look at those big yellow eyes on a snowy owl. There is just, as Peter said, there's just something absolutely riveting and magical about snowy owls. They have such a presence about them. My involvement with snowy owls, I mean, I've been chasing snowy owls for years. I've always been delighted when I've been able to cross paths with them, but I'd never worked with them in a professional sense, in a scientific sense, until about 8 or 9 years ago. When, as I'm sure pretty much everybody on this call recalls, we had an extraordinary snowy owl winter. This is an eBird map of kind of a typical snowy owl distribution across the Great Lakes, the Ottawa and St. Lawrence River valleys, and down along the coast of New England in a typical, kind of a typical decent winter. This was January of 2013. Well, this was December of 2013, which was far from a typical year for snowy owls. In fact, this was the largest snowy owl flight into eastern North America since at least the winter of 1926, 1927, and possibly as far back as the 1890s. And when this happened, when this wall of snowy owls came advancing down out of the eastern and central Canadian Arctic to such an extent that, birders at Cape Race in Newfoundland, were able to count 75 snowy owls in one sweep of their binoculars. When this wave of white hit the east, a lot of not particularly correct interpretations of what was going on kind of flooded into the media, and many of this from experienced birders and knowledgeable ornithologists. The line that was being shared with the public was that these snowy owls had been driven south out of the Arctic by a lack of food. That the prey on which they depend in the Arctic, the lemmings on which they depend, the populations of lemmings had crashed, and these starving bereft snowy owls were forced to wander south across this alien southern landscape where they could find very little food and where probably most of them were going to die. And pretty much everything about that story is wrong. And in fact, as I'm sure many of you are aware, it was not privation that drove this enormous flight of snowy owls, but actually plenty. The previous summer, in the summer of 2013, across many parts of the Eastern Arctic and subarctic, but particularly the Ungava Peninsula, lemming populations reached historic highs, 40 or 50-year highs. And snowy owls, using we don't really know what sense, figured out where these lemmings were, and many of them gathered in the northern Ungava. And scenes like this were fairly common in northern Quebec, where you had 4 or 5 snowy owl eggs in the middle of a nest surrounded by, and feel free to count them, 78 dead lemmings and voles. And when I share this picture and I explain to people, especially non-birders, that this is one enthusiastic male. I mean, the babies haven't really even hatched yet, and he's just piling up the food. And you can kind of see the women in the audience going, "Oh yeah, God, men, what can you do?" But the fact of the matter is, there's a solid biological reason for this. Basically, what he's telling his mate in as vivid a way as possible is, "Baby, don't stop with 4. There's plenty of food. Just keep popping out babies, keep popping out eggs." And in fact, that summer, all across the Ungava, there was an abundance of nesting snowy owls, and many of those nests had 5, 6, 7, 8, even 9 chicks, almost all of which made it to fledging because there was so much food. And that winter, all of those young snowy owls, or at least many of them, headed south on their first migration. And so we had this historic eruption of snowy owls moving down into eastern North America. I was at the time trying to finish what was by then already a late manuscript for my Peterson reference guide to owls of North America and the Caribbean, and was hoping to spend a quiet winter getting caught up on that before my editor at Houghton Mifflin killed me. But shortly after American Thanksgiving in early December, my good friend Dave Brinker, with the Maryland Department of Natural Resources and the founder of Project OWLnet, with whom I've been doing Saw-whet Owl and other owl research for many years, called me up and said, "Have you been paying attention to what's going on with snowy owls?" And of course I had. I mean, by that point, it was obvious to everybody in southern Canada and the northeastern United States that something extraordinary was underway. Dave said, "Look, none of us are going to live long enough to see something like this happen again. We need to do everything we can to capitalize on this opportunity to learn as much as we can about snowy owls." And so in a matter of about 2 weeks, along with people like my good friend and colleague Norman Smith from Massachusetts Audubon, who's been studying snowy owls at Logan Airport in Boston since 1981, Mike Lanzone, who is a golden eagle biologist who founded cellular tracking technologies to build transmitters to track golden eagles and other raptors, but who got his start as a kid in Rochester, New York, trapping snowy owls with Tom McDonald. A bunch of us put our heads together, submitted a proposal to the US Banding Lab, looking for permission to start putting some of CTT's transmitters on snowy owls to learn a little bit more about their winter movements. Do not let anybody tell you that the government cannot move with alacrity when it wants to. We got approval for this project in 20 minutes. Because as it turns out, the Banding Lab was already talking about, wanting to find somebody to do the same sort of thing. And so Project SNOWstorm was born. And I want to put a particular shout out here to Paul Riss. I think Paul might be on the talk tonight, for allowing us to use PRBY's terrific snowy owl art there as part of our Project SNOWstorm logo. We came up with this idea. We basically pulled this idea out of our butts in about 2 weeks. This is not the way you do science. Usually science involves months or years of planning and sending proposals off to foundations looking for funding and being rejected, and and then going back to the drawing board. And we just kind of launched this thing on a wing and a prayer. And it has grown exponentially ever since. Project SNOWstorm is now one of the largest snowy owl research projects in the world. And there's a bunch of different elements to it. The one that has garnered the most attention and is frankly the sexiest part of what we do is the tracking, using these high-tech GPS GSM transmitters that I'll talk a little bit more about in a minute, to tag, as of last week, about 106 snowy owls in 17 states and provinces, from Alaska through the prairies in the Dakotas and on up into Quebec and Nunavut down into the Mid-Atlantic and New England. But we've got other aspects to Project SNOWstorm that don't get quite as much attention. For example, whether we're putting a tag on the bird or not, we're going to a lot of trouble to catch wild snowy owls. So we collect feather and blood and DNA samples that we can use for isotopic analysis, for genetic and toxicology analysis. We have a team of wildlife veterinarians headed up by Dr. Cindy Driscoll from Maryland's Department of Natural Resources, wildlife veterinarians and pathologists that work with state and federal and provincial agencies to salvage and necropsy as many dead snowy owls as we can find. At this point, we've necropsied somewhere in the order of about 350 snowy owls to learn as much as we can about the health of these birds, what kind of diseases are coming down from the Arctic with, what kind of contaminant landscape they're inhabiting when they're down here. And just to find out, this is something that was really never explored to any great degree in the past. One of the things that we've been able to prove using all of that necropsy information is that, big surprise, well, not a surprise to those who've been paying attention to snowy owls, most of the snowy owls that are coming south in the fall and winter are perfectly healthy. They're fat, they're not starving, they're not driven by hunger and privation. Yeah, a lot of them wind up at rehabilitation sites, but those are the ones that are unlucky in some respect. The birds that are kind of sampled at random by jet planes and vehicles are for the most part perfectly healthy right up until the moment they get hit by a jet plane or a vehicle. We've even asked photographers to send us geotagged photographs showing the spread wings and tails of snowy owls, which allow us to determine age and sex class distributions. We've been able to do that to see how different age and sex classes are distributed across these eruption events. And I don't want you to read all of that text, but I just want to say that we have about 40 core members of the Project SNOWstorm team. And it's important to note that almost all of these folks, whether they are bird banders or researchers, academicians, agency personnel, some of them are able to help Project SNOWstorm through their day jobs, but for the most part, almost all of them donate all of their time to Project SNOWstorm. Nobody with Project SNOWstorm gets any kind of a stipend. Nobody's any kind of a salary, which was a good thing because when we launched Project SNOWstorm, we had no budget. There again, the way you normally do science is you line up your funding first, but we launched this thing with basically a little bit of money that we had from a couple of large private donors that covered the expense of buying the first couple of transmitters that we put out. And then somebody said, well, hey, why don't we try crowdfunding? And I have to admit that I thought this was the dumbest idea I had ever heard of. The idea, I said, let me get this straight. You want us to ask strangers to give us money to play with owls, because that's what it's going to sound like to people. And they said, yeah, that's what we should do. And so we launched a crowdfunding campaign that first year, and we raised more than $36,000 US in small donations from all around the world, tax deductible for those of us in the US. And we got a roughly equal amount that first winter in donations from organizations like the Pennsylvania Society for Ornithology, the Delmarva Ornithological Society, the Wisconsin Natural Heritage Foundation that underwrote the deployment of transmitters on snowy owls in those areas. And it has been a remarkably successful funding model. Project SNOWstorm is still entirely funded by small tax-deductible contributions that we get from all over the world. Every year we set up a goal of raising about $15,000 or $20,000. All of that money goes into the field or into the lab to pay for the transmitters, to pay for for lab analysis fees, shipping, that kind of stuff. Very occasionally, we'll send one of our people to the International Snowy Owl Working Group meeting, which last occurred in Norway about 2 days before the COVID lockdowns hit, Dave Brinker and JF Therian from our team barely made it back in time. And Karen Wiebe from Saskatchewan, I understand Karen got caught in Norway for a while because she didn't get on the plane in time. The majority of what we raise, the money we raise, goes into the transmitters. We have a good relationship with cellular tracking technology. They have been giving us price breaks on these transmitters, but they cost about $1,000 a piece. And so these transmitters, we've spent a lot of time over the years refining the designs, learning a little bit more about snowy owls. Snowy owls have a reputation for being diurnal. In the wintertime, they're not. They're really nocturnal birds, but they sit out in the open. So we thought, this is great. We can use solar-powered transmitters on snowy owls, except if you've ever watched a snowy owl, they're like little sunflowers. They tend to face the sun all day long, which means their back is in shade all day long. So we had to develop much more efficient solar panels, a higher transmitter case to keep that solar panel up above the very thick plumage that these birds have. But these transmitters are basically operating using two technologies most of you have in your pocket right now. They're in constant contact with the GPS satellite system overhead. So they're constantly recording as frequently as every 6 seconds, latitude, longitude, altitude, and flight speed. And then a couple times a week, they dial up through the cell phone network and they send all of that data through the GSM cell network, which goes to show that my friends are cooler than your friends because I get text messages from snowy owls. And in fact, while we've been sitting here this evening, I've gotten 2 text messages from one of our snowy owls, Wells, that's been wintering again this year, as she has for the last 5 or 6 years in Quebec City, and a bird we call Stella that was originally tagged on Amherst Island, who's been out in the prairies ever since, and she's in south central Saskatchewan this winter. They both checked in this evening. Of course, in order to tag a snowy owl, first you have to catch a snowy owl. We use these big spring-loaded bow nets to catch them. Sometimes we use modified fly traps, a couple of other things. This is an old photograph of a snowy owl coming in on a harnessed pigeon. All of our lure animals today, all of our Project SNOWstorm trapping teams use caged lure animals. We have always been very careful to protect our lure birds and our lure animals, but this way we know there's no chance that the owl is going to harm them at all. Once we got the bird in the hand, we put a standard service leg band on them. We take all the standard measurements: wing chord and tail, bill length. One thing you will notice if you've ever had a snowy owl in the hand is that they are literally a lousy bird. And those, I mean, feather lice. They are, I don't know if it's just because snowy owls being white, the lice, and that's what all those little flecks you see on this bird are, these chewing lice. They're not sucking lice, they're not blood-sucking lice, but they feed on the feathers. These lice are very obvious and abundant on snowy owls. But I also suspect that because melanin stiffens the feathers and provides structural integrity, there's some evidence to suggest that white feathers are much easier for chewing lice to digest. And so I think that a snowy owl is just the land of milk and honey for a feather louse. It takes us about 45 minutes or an hour to put one of these transmitters on. This is one of our older styles. We use, in the old days, we used Teflon ribbon, woven Teflon ribbon. We now use woven Spectra, which is even tougher. And as with the Teflon is very slick and does not abrade because this is right down against the bird's skin. We are very careful putting these transmitters on because the bird's going to be wearing this for the rest of its life. There's no, drop off, harness break or anything on there. These transmitters can last for years. We've been tracking some of our snowy owls for more than 6 years. We're getting great data from them. So we are very, very careful and very fussy about how we put these on. There've been many times when we've finished harnessing a snowy owl, not been happy with the way the transmitter fit, took it off and started again. But the transmitters weigh about 40 grams or so. They're about the size of a matchbox, less than 3% of the bird's body weight, which is generally considered to be a safe threshold for any kind of transmitter or other auxiliary attachment on a bird. They sit up in the middle of the bird's back at the center of its gravity, and off it goes. While we've got the bird in the hand, we try to take as much information, get as much information from the bird as we can. So as I said before, we'll take blood samples. We like working with Other scientists, for example, a couple of years ago, we were working with a scientist who studies blood parasites in snowy owls. He found several previously undocumented species of Plasmodium, avian malaria parasites that had never been documented in owls before. And it is not an exaggeration to say that every single snowy owl that we have tracked, starting with the first one, has surprised us. The first bird we tagged was a juvenile male on Assateague Island on the eastern shore of Maryland in December of 2013. We figured, if anything, he'd probably keep heading south because it was early in the winter, and instead he turned around and went north, crossed Delaware Bay, spent part of the winter near Cape May, and then moved further up the coast and spent the rest of the winter up on Barnegat Bay. And the information that we get from these transmitters, as I said, is remarkably detailed. We can, because the transmitters communicate with us through the cell phone network, we can change the rate at which they're collecting data. We can get into what we call flight mode, which, as I said earlier, allows us to collect a GPS location every 6 seconds. We've never used flight mode that much because until recently it had a tendency to drain the battery, and as you can imagine, it's a lot of power. But actually, I've just found out from CTT that they've done some software changes that may allow us to use flight mode on a regular basis, which is going to be extraordinary. We also have accelerometers in these transmitters that will allow us to actually record like the number of wing beats that these birds are generating. And so you can see that exactly where these birds are on minute to minute and sometimes second by second basis. And you're going to see a couple of different types of maps this evening. What I was just showing you a moment ago is in Google Earth. That's how we get the raw data in a KML file that comes in from the transmitters. But I wanted to show you this map. This is that same bird, that first snowy owl that we tagged that first winter, a bird we called Assateague. And in this map, everything in red is daytime locations or movements, and everything in blue is nighttime locations or movements. And as you can see, these birds in the wintertime, when it gets dark at night, are primarily nocturnal. This bird was spending most of its time sitting quietly during the day on little islands out in Barnegat Bay. But what drew my eye when we were looking at this was this location out in the middle, the stationary location out in the middle of Barnegat Bay. Later in the winter, that bay froze over completely, but at that time this was taken, this was still open water. We thought, what on earth's going on here? Snowy owls, I mean, they don't float. But if you kept zooming in on Google Earth, under all those points was a buoy, was a channel marker. And so basically what this bird was doing was taking off and flying out into Barnegat Bay at night and sitting on that channel mark and saying, let's see, I had a scaup last night, maybe it's going to be a bufflehead this evening, or perhaps a brant. And that was one of the things that I think was an eye-opener to a lot of people that were paying attention to Project SNOWstorm, was the degree to which these snowy owls were spending a lot of their time hunting out over open water, along Delaware Bay, Chesapeake Bay, along the Atlantic coast. Not a surprise to snowy owl specialists like Norman Smith and Tom McDonald and others who've known for years that snowy owls feed very heavily on waterfowl and do a lot of their hunting offshore at night. But I think to the average birder and bird interested person who was following Project SNOWstorm, that was a revelation. One of the really cool things about this project is that we get to peer into the lives and, in a sense, the personalities of individual birds, and you realize how individualistic they are. This was a juvenile female that we trapped again down on Assateague Island that first year, a bird we called Hungerford. And this bird was all over the place that winter, moved up through Delaware into eastern Pennsylvania, spent a couple of weeks in Amish country down in Lancaster County, looped back down to the New Jersey coast and spent the rest of the winter near Cape May. Traveled hundreds of miles. We've had other snowy owls that have roamed continuously all winter long from as far north as almost New York City, all the way down to the southern tip of the Delmarva Peninsula, at the tip of the eastern shore of Virginia, probably put almost 1,000 miles under his wings. And then you have these two adult female snowy owls in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan. Each of those blobs are about 1/4 of a mile across. Sorry, I can't do a kilometer conversion in my head, but very small, very tight territories. Now, you might think, okay, well, that's because the other one was a juvenile and these are adults, except we've seen the same kind of wide-ranging behavior in adults and the same kind of really tight, highly localized behavior in juveniles. I suspect it has more to do with local prey base than anything. But what I find really interesting about these two territories is how there was no trespassing. In fact, the only time that redbird went through the middle of the yellowbird's territory is after the yellowbird had already left for the spring. But if your neighbor weighs 2,600 grams and has 8 razor sharp, needle sharp talons at the end of very powerful feet, maybe you don't trespass. Our transmitters also give us altitude information when these birds are in flight. And this is actually the first time with any owl species anywhere on Earth that we've been able to get migratory altitude and also migratory bout extent information. I've done a lot of my work over the years with northern saw-whet owls, as I said, in the mountains of eastern Pennsylvania, where there was a lot of wind turbine development. I cannot tell you how many times I've been asked by wind energy developers at what altitude northern saw-whet owls migrate, and I can't tell you after a quarter century because we can't get this kind of information. We don't have transmitters small enough for saw-whet owls, but we've got it for snowy owls. And we know from looking at the altitudes at which these birds are sometimes crossing places like the Great Lakes that wind turbine development is kind of right about where they're flying. They're generally flying relatively low to the ground, 500 to 1,000 feet, and they're relatively lazy migrants. They'll fly for an hour or two and then land, take a short break, fly for an hour or two, land, take a short break. But we also know that when they want to, they can fly long distances very, very rapidly. And we've seen this with many of our owls coming back down from the Arctic and the subarctic in late winter when they may come blasting down out of the central Canadian Arctic and fly 750 or 1,000 miles basically nonstop to come back south again. And they can really move at a pretty good clip when they want to. It's also been fascinating to watch the behavior and wintering behavior of these birds change with time. For example, this is a young male that we caught that first winter at a small, actually, I shouldn't say we caught him, it was caught by wildlife contractors at a small municipal airport outside of Baltimore, Maryland. He's, male snowy owls, like most raptors, are smaller than the females. And we did not have a transmitter model that was small enough for this very diminutive male that was available at the time. We had 2 different size transmitters. We just didn't have one for him. So we abandoned him, moved him to Western Maryland, released him in the farmland there. The next winter, he came back to the same small airport where he was trapped again, having whitened a bit in his second year. This time we moved him to the coast of Maryland. We did put a transmitter on him. We dubbed him Baltimore because his transmitter was paid for by the Baltimore Bird Club. And we were able to follow him for the rest of that winter. He moved up the New Jersey coast, spent a lot of the winter up there. He was kind of a surf and turf guy. That first bird I showed you, Assateague, spent all of his nighttime hunting hours out over open water, feeding on waterfowl. Baltimore would feed on waterfowl from what we could tell, but he was also doing a lot of hunting over land. And then in the spring, and this is 2015, spring of 2015 rather, he headed north, and you see, he went through New York City. And when I say he went through New York City, I mean he went right through the middle of Manhattan. And in fact, at 2 o'clock in the morning, he was perched on top of a 58-story skyscraper next to Madison Square Garden, which ironically is that round building. This is the view he had from up there. He apparently didn't like it because he kept on moving. Headed up to Lake Ontario and then all the way up into the northern Ungava, which is probably where he had been born 2 years earlier, just because that's where that enormous breeding event was. He was part of that big summer of 2013 breeding event. Baltimore was cool because we tracked him for about another 5 years. Interestingly, he never went that far south again. And thereafter, he wintered either on Amherst Island or then in all of his subsequent years in the Ottawa River Valley over around Arnprior. And in fact, it's while he was wintering in Arnprior that his his transmitter went on the fritz, but he was so faithful to that wintering site that we were able to track him there through the help of Dan and Pat LaFortune from the Toronto area for the next 2 years before David Okines from Prince Edward Point was able to trap him, and we were able to take that failed transmitter off him. Unfortunately, we were not able to get permission to put a new transmitter on him. There were just a couple of permit hoops that we weren't able to jump through in time, but he'd given us a tremendous amount of good information. Sometimes, though, when you get the data from these birds, your first reaction is to kind of sit there with your mouth open, scratching your head, wondering what's going on. So in this particular map format, this is the stuff we get, kind of the raw data, all of those square icons represent a stationary location. Any of the little triangles, those are mobile points, but these are at 30-minute intervals. And the bird was moving at about 1/4 mile an hour. And this was out on the frozen surface of Lake Erie, a bird that we had tagged in Erie, Pennsylvania. And when I first saw this, I thought, oh my God, he's walking to Canada, because that was about the speed this bird was going. It took a day or two before the penny dropped, and we realized that no, this is what happens when you have a stationary owl sitting on an enormous sheet of ice that is very, very slowly being pushed by prevailing winds from the southwest to the northeast. And you can see how this bird was periodically flying short distances and then eventually, kind of gave up and flew back to land. But when you see things like that, you think, oh my God, what is going on here? That winter, it was interesting. We had 2 young male snowy owls that we tagged in Erie that spent about 6 weeks out on the almost entirely frozen surface of Lake Erie. That was an extraordinarily cold winter, as many of you will remember. And Lake Erie was about 98.5% frozen. And so we had to wonder, what on earth are they eating out there? But if it's 98.5% frozen, that means it's 1.5% thawed. And when we were watching daily satellite images from NOAA, we realized that as the prevailing winds were pushing from the south or from the north, it was opening up big cracks in the ice. And in those cracks, in those open areas, were ducks and geese and gulls and grebes and loons and other water birds on which these owls were feeding. And what's really cool is I think, and one of the coolest things that we've come up with in this project is that, in a sense, these young birds were practicing for a much more challenging lifestyle in the Arctic, because we know from tracking work that Laval University and others have done in the Canadian Arctic that some snowy owls winter in the north. They actually migrate north out onto the sea ice and spend the winter hunting sea ducks and alcids out on these permanent polynias, these permanent openings in the sea ice. So in a way, these young birds may be practicing a technique they're gonna follow as adults in a much more challenging environment. We have birds in some of the most remote and isolated environments in the east in the winter, and some of them right in the middle of the biggest metropolitan areas. This was a bird, an adult, juvenile female rather, that was trapped at that same small airport outside of Baltimore. We put a transmitter on her, we moved her to Western Maryland. She flew right back to the middle of Baltimore and spent the rest of the winter in downtown Baltimore. And the cool thing about this was you can use the Google Street View feature to see basically, oh, okay, so this bird really likes the roof of this church as a roost and a hunting site. I would not have wanted to be a free-running house cat in that neighborhood. I mentioned Norman Smith earlier. Norman has been studying snowy owls longer than almost anyone. He's been at it since 1981. That first winter, he moved 173 snowy owls from Logan Airport, and we tagged about 8 or 9 of Norman's birds. But these were predominantly young owls, and young birds get in trouble. We saw that even with some of the birds that Norman had tagged. This is a bird called Sandy Neck that he had moved down to Cape Cod and released. This bird flew out to the island of Martha's Vineyard, which is, rather tony place to spend the winter if you're a snowy owl. And it was mostly hanging around the main harbor at the northeastern side of Martha's Vineyard. But in March of that year, March of 2014, a huge nor'easter storm with hurricane force winds came blowing up. And this young bird, just before daybreak, tried to fly across that open water at a point where there were 80-mile-an-hour winds and waves of 20 plus feet. And we don't know if the wind pushed her down or a big wave caught her, but she wound up in the water and drowned, washed up on the beach. We had another one of our tagged snowy owls that died under identical circumstances in that same storm in Gloucester, Massachusetts, a little bit further to the north. And we knew of at least another half dozen unbanded, untagged snowy owls, all of them juvenile birds, that likewise drowned. We had another big nor'easter that hit here a couple of weeks ago. And once again, we know of a number of young snowy owls that drowned along the New England coast. I suspect an older, more experienced adult would not have taken that risk. But young birds make bad decisions. But the biggest danger for snowy owls when they come south, not surprisingly, are humans. And one of the things that we've been able to do with all of these hundreds and hundreds of birds that we've necropsied is get a sense of what the biggest risks are for snowy owls. And the biggest danger for snowy owls by far when they come south is trauma, and particularly vehicular trauma, either getting hit by cars and trucks along highways, or getting struck by planes, or the jet blast from planes at airports, because of course snowy owls love airports. It might seem strange that a bird from such a remote part of the world would be drawn to such a wildly noisy, congested place as airports. But think about it. If you're coming from the high Arctic, a tree is as alien to you as a jetliner is. I don't know that the one is any more surprising or frightening than the other. And of course, in many environments, in many landscapes, airports are the only place that look a little bit like home to a snowy owl. They're flat, they're open, they're treeless. They look a little bit like the tundra. And of course, airports have a lot of grass, and they're often very good places for snowy owls to hunt. And they're also obviously very dangerous places for snowy owls. And, snowy owls can be dangerous to planes. Nothing will ruin your day quite like having a snowy owl come through the windscreen of your jet on takeoff while you're sitting back in, seat 36F. So one of the things that we've been doing from the beginning with Project SNOWstorm is working with airport authorities and federal and provincial and state and private wildlife contractors and agency personnel to figure out the best ways to keep airplanes and owls apart. And particularly since a lot of airports now put a lot of time and effort and money into having people trap and relocate snowy owls. Let's figure out the best way to move snowy owls so they stay moved and don't come back to the airport. This is actually the very first snowy owl that I ever put a transmitter on, a bird that I trapped at the Philadelphia International Airport in January of 2013. We had a terrific relationship with the folks at the airport there, including the wildlife services biologist that was helping us. That's her with the snowy owl there. We trapped this bird, we put a transmitter on him, we put him in a car, we drove him 50 miles west into Amish farmland in Lancaster County, which that winter was just crawling with snowy owls, really terrific habitat for snowy owls. And within 2 days, that bird was back at the airport again. And Jenny and I spent a lot of time, Jenny Martin, the USDA biologist, there spent a lot of time trying to retrap that bird, but he was having none of it. Interestingly, he wasn't really hunting the airport. He was hunting mostly along Interstate 95, hunting for rats and mice and rabbits out there, paying no attention to all the waterfowl on the Delaware River right there next to the airport. And unfortunately, one morning just at daybreak, he flew across the runway just as a cargo jet was taking off. Killed him instantly, but it didn't bring down the plane, which was probably the most important thing. Since then, we have tagged something close to 50 snowy owls at about 13 airports in the US and Canada. We have a paper that is in press right now, kind of analyzing all of the work we've done. It looks like, not surprisingly, the farther you move a snowy owl, the better. The kind of habitat you move the snowy owl into, again, not surprisingly, moving a snowy owl into especially grassland and pasture habitat as opposed to just row cropland where there may not be a lot of small mammals, makes a big difference. And also it appears that holding the snowy owl for 24 to 48 hours, if possible, feeding the bird while you have it, of course, and then releasing it may also significantly decrease the chance that the bird's going to fly right back to the airport. I say that, but this winter we have tagged 6 snowy owls at airports in Montreal, Rochester, New York, and Detroit, Michigan, and 5 of the 6 of them went right back to the airport. So sometimes you just can't help a snowy owl. You just can't convince them to help themselves. As I said before, we have a terrific team of wildlife veterinarians and wildlife pathologists whom I wish we could get a picture where they don't look quite so cheerful to have a dead snowy owl. But this is, after all, what they do. That's Dr. Cindy Driscoll on the left from Maryland's Department of Natural Resources, Dr. Cheryl Davison in the middle from the University of Pennsylvania's New Bolton Center, and Dr. Erica Miller with, again, the University of Pennsylvania and what's known as the Wildlife Futures Program in Pennsylvania, which is a partnership between Penn and the Pennsylvania Game Commission studying emerging wildlife diseases. As I said, they've necropsied hundreds and hundreds of snowy owls, looking at, for example, the kind of parasitic loads they carry and diseases and problems we didn't really expect to see with snowy owls. For example, a couple of winters ago, there was a major die-off of snowy owls on Block Island on the coast of Rhode Island. And when our team started necropsying, they discovered that their lungs and their air sacs, particularly their air sacs, were packed with parasitic nematodes. And I apologize if I'm creeping anybody out after dinner here this evening. It's a species of nematode that is common in gallinaceous birds, in which it is found primarily in the digestive system. But when it gets consumed by other raptors, the nematodes don't know where to go, and they go into the respiratory system and kill the bird. Well, it turns out Block Island is one of the only places along the Atlantic coast that has a self-sustaining population of exotic ringneck pheasants. And so these exotic ringneck pheasants are probably posing a significant health risk to snowy owls that spend the winter there. We've also been doing a lot of toxicology work. This is one of the most important things that we're doing with these snowy owls, because we're trying to understand the contaminant landscape that these birds are facing when they come south. And so, a lot of the money that we raise in Project SNOWstorm goes into paying for what is a highly discounted rate that we're getting through the University of Pennsylvania and the New Bolton Center and the Pennsylvania Animal Diagnostic Laboratory System. But nevertheless, it's a significant cost for us, but it's important information. We expected that we were going to see a lot of rodenticide in these snowy owls, and sadly, we've not been disappointed in that. We have seen a significant amount of rodenticide. Almost every owl that we catch has some detectable degree of rodenticide, especially once they've been down in the south for more than just a couple of weeks. And some of these birds have shockingly high levels of rodenticide. Now, the thing to remember about rodenticide is that they are an anticoagulant. It kills a rat by essentially forcing it to bleed to death. And what are known as second generation rodenticides, these new rat killers that have come out in the last couple of years, are not just secondary poisons that kill the birds and animals that feed on those rats. They can even be tertiary poisons that kill the animal that eats the animal that eats the rat. And they can also have sublethal effects because they're anticoagulants. There is a risk if the bird gets badly lacerated that its injury may not clot and the bird may bleed to death. The other thing that we have found in shocking and worrisome levels are methylmercury. Mercury, of course, is an air pollutant that bioaccumulates through aquatic food chains. And once it precipitates out into water, it, just like DDT used to, it moves at higher and higher levels as you move higher and higher up the food chain. And a lot of these snowy owls are feeding on fish-eating birds like mergansers and loons and grebes. And so they're getting really high levels of methylmercury. That can interfere with reproduction. It can interfere with behavior. In fact, one of the questions we're starting to ask is maybe these snowy owls that are getting whacked by vehicles are are cognitively impaired to some degree by methylmercury poisoning. One of the things we're hoping to start to do is to use our tracking data to also look at how methylmercury levels may vary between snowy owls that are wintering in terrestrial areas and feeding, as far as we can tell, entirely on mammals and land birds, versus those that are wintering along the Great Lake coasts, versus those that are wintering along marine coasts, along the Atlantic coast. Because methylmercury levels in freshwater aquatic environments tend to be higher than those in saltwater marine environments. But we're very early days in that study right now. In late March, early April, most of these snowy owls start moving north again. And as they do, we tend to lose track of them. As I said before, these transmitters communicate through the cell phone network. So once the snowy owls get out of range of the cell network, and Americans are always kind of shocked by this map. I'm sure Canadians would not be, that the vast majority of the Canadian cell phone network is down there in southern Ontario, where you folks are, and it does not take much for them to get north of that cell network. Although increasingly there are a lot of cell phone towers in small rural communities and bush communities all across the north, and so we're getting more and more hits up there. But for the most part, once these birds move out of southern Canada, we lose track of them. But their transmitters keep on recording data, logging them in their data banks. We can store up to 12 years worth of data in those data banks without running out of room. And then when they come back south again in a subsequent winter, not necessarily the next winter, but sometimes 2 or 3 years later, we get a massive data dump. And so we can see where these birds have gone. We did not start Project SNOWstorm with the idea of studying, the north and south migration and summer ecology of these birds, but this has been a cherry on the sundae for us. We've got really some of the most detailed movement data for snowy owls on their migration and on their summer breeding grounds that anybody's ever gotten before. Most of the tracking that's been done on the breeding grounds has been using traditional satellite transmitters that give you much less frequent duty cycles, much less frequent GPS fixes. Overall, there's what all of our snowy owls through last winter have done over the years. And you can see there's some fairly obvious main migration routes that these birds are taking, up through the boreal forest between Lake Ontario and Erie and southern James Bay, which we also know that's a fairly dangerous transit for these birds. We've lost a fair number of, particularly our young snowies, but actually even a fair number of our adult snowies, moving north in the springtime through the boreal forest. That's an alien environment for them. Moving, I find it really interesting how a lot of the birds in the Midwest move to the west and north before they move up through Manitoba and Saskatchewan and up into the central Canadian Arctic. And some of them bounce around. One of the things that we and others studying snowy owls, people like Karen Wiebe at University of Saskatchewan, some of our colleagues in Europe and Scandinavia and Greenland that are working there, are finding is that young snowy owls in their first or second migration will wander quite a bit. They haven't really figured out where they're going to go. But once they become adults, they really do become fairly site faithful. Some of them, like the bird I mentioned earlier that has been wintering in Quebec City year after year after year. I mean, she comes back to the same neighborhood in Quebec City pretty much every year near a large old Catholic convent. And another one of our birds that we originally tagged at Amherst Island, I mentioned, is wintering in Saskatchewan this year. Some years she's in southern Manitoba, some years she's in North Dakota, some years she's in southern Saskatchewan. 1 year you can see she actually went down into northern Montana. But she's been moving north and south through the prairies and up into the central Canadian Arctic, even though she almost certainly was born in the Ungava. So really fascinating stuff. And I love the level of detail we get with some of these birds. This was a bird that we had a couple of years ago that was originally tagged in North Dakota. And I want to zoom in on where it spent the summer. That's what the breeding range of a snowy owl looks like at this level of detail. You're looking at about 150 to 200 meter east to west area here, that pile of hundreds to thousands of GPS points right at the nest location and a couple of spots around there where the bird was using as observation perches and maybe just to get away from the kids a little bit. It's also been cool to see how these birds change their behavior from year to year. This was one of those birds I mentioned that spent the entire winter out on the frozen surface of Lake Erie in the winter of 2013, 2014. When that bird came south again the next year, we figured, okay, this is a maritime bird. This is a bird that loves those aquatic, ice, roaming around on the ice out in frozen Great Lakes. Except this bird came down to the edge of Lake Ontario, took one look around, and then backtracked up to the Toronto airport and spent the rest of the winter around, but not on the airport. And the reason he was not on the airport is because there was a great big old dominant adult female at the airport that winter that was basically territorially excluding him. So the first winter he spends out on the ice of Lake Erie feeding on water birds. The next year, inland feeding, so far as we could tell, exclusively on small mammals and rabbits. So much for specialization on the part of these birds. I want to leave you with one last track here that it's just like, this was another one of those, oh my God, what does this mean kind of moments. And this is what I just find endlessly fascinating about this bird. This was a bird that we tagged in Pennsylvania that flew north to the edge of Hudson Bay, actually went out onto Hudson Bay before coming back onto land again. And imagine trying to make sense of that. I mean, do some of you remember those old spirograph things that some of us of a certain age had when kids, where you can make these like kind of fancy spiral designs with? Anyway, it looks like a spirograph design, except done by a snowy owl. And it took a day or two to figure out that this is what it looks like when a snowy owl is riding on an iceberg out in Hudson Bay. If you look down at that loop across the bottom, these big curly cues, well, you can see the bird was moving from right to left. And that's what happens. I don't know if you can see my cursor here, but if you can, it was moving when the wind and the tide are moving in the same direction, it goes a long way, and then the tide turns against the wind and it doesn't go so far, and then the wind and the tide go in the same direction and back, and then the wind shifts out of the north and shifts out of the west, and the bird finally says, screw it, I'm flying back to land again. All of that stuff makes this just such an enjoyable, fascinating project, and such a privilege to be able to do this with the help of so many people. All of the tracking data from all of the snowy owls that we have on Project SNOWstorm is publicly available. If you go to our website at www.projectsnowstorm.org, and you might want to take a screenshot right now of your computer so you can save that URL. All of the 100 and some birds that we have tagged, all of the data is on there. It's updated in real time as those updates come in, usually about 3 times a week, usually Tuesday, Thursday, and Sunday evenings. But it's all offset by about 24 hours. So you will not see where the owl is right this minute, because we are cautious about the owl. If we, on rare occasion, we'll get a bird that is in a tricky position where we don't want anybody to know where it is, and we will mask that location. But I have to say, we've been very fortunate that we've really not had much trouble with that over the years. So come on for the ride. We would love to have you as a supporter of Project SNOWstorm. You can sign up for our web updates, our blog updates. I usually post something about every week or so about what's been going on. It's an amazing project. It's only possible because of support from the community. Those of you who are with us this evening who have been Project SNOWstorm supporters, and I know there's a whole bunch of you, thank you from the bottom of our hearts. We're going to keep doing this as long as you guys support us. And with that, I'm going to stop my screen share. I'm going to take a drink of water, and then I will be happy to answer any questions that anybody has.
Wow, that was awesome. Peter was right. Wowed on a few of those comments and stats. So yeah, I've got there's people who are going to hopefully be adding questions to the Q&A and to the chat. So put them in now. We can ask that of Scott over the next little bit. I do want to. I have a couple questions myself. Can you walk us through like what an average day may look like for you with regards to this project? And you could be as vague and as specific as you'd like, but like,
Oh,
what does that look like for you?
I get to do the boring stuff. I haven't really been doing a whole lot of trapping. We were actually hoping, one of our projects we were hoping to do this winter was to deploy transmitters on snowy owls in Acadia National Park in Maine, because snowy owls winter almost every winter on Cadillac, the summits of Cadillac and Sargent Mountains, in Acadia, up in the alpine zone there. And to my knowledge, nobody has ever studied snowy owl ecology in alpine zones in North America. I think there's been a little work done in alpine regions of Scandinavia, but because of there was government red tape involved, is what it comes down to, and we weren't able to get the permits in place before kind of really serious winter weather came in, and it just would have been really difficult to trap up there. I was hoping to tag some snowy owls with the USDA Wildlife Services people here in the state of New Hampshire at our local former Air Force base, but none of the snowy owls they caught this winter were really suitable for tagging. They were mostly very small males, and we just were not comfortable with putting a transmitter on a bird quite that small. So yeah, I get to do things like writing the blog posts and convening our weekly core snowstorm team Zoom call and all that boring administrative stuff. Watching the money and paying bills and things like that. I want to say I should mention that Project SNOWstorm's institutional home, we're very fortunate. The Ned Smith Center for Nature and Art in central Pennsylvania, which is also the institutional home for Project OwlNet, which helps coordinate a lot of especially Saw-whet Owl banding around North America. They have been a terrific support to us by providing the U.S. tax deductible framework for us, so that people in the U.S. who contribute to Project SNOWstorm can take a federal tax deduction for that. They've been fantastic to work with. So I should have mentioned that earlier, and I'm glad I had an opportunity to give them a shout out.
Sure. Yeah. So much of the work that goes on in the scientific community is a result of good partnerships and great people. And we've got a lot of great questions coming into the chat and the Q&A right now. Let me just ask one kind of population question. Do we know what population sizes are like of snowy owls in North America, roughly?
That's a really good question, and it speaks very directly to why many of us are concerned about snowy owls. So for a very, very long time, the global population estimate for snowy owls was about 300,000 snowy owls worldwide, about half of those in North America, the majority of those in Canada. Canada is really the breadbasket of snowy owls in North America. That population assessment was done before that, and it was a guesstimate, is what it was. It was done before we understood the remarkable degree to which snowy owls are highly nomadic during the breeding season. And a lot of this is work that was done by folks at Laval University working at Bylot Island in Canada, elsewhere in the Western Canadian Arctic, Denver Holt in Alaska, a number of Russian researchers working in Wrangel Island and elsewhere in the Russian Arctic, documenting the fact, and a lot of our colleagues as well in Scandinavia and Greenland, documenting the fact that these snowy owls are moving like thousands of kilometers between breeding seasons. They can be on Bylot Island one year and Greenland the next year, or Alaska one year and Siberia the next year. So there was a recognition about 15 years ago that we in the scientific community has been grossly overestimating and double or triple counting snowy owls, because they just basically added up maximum numbers of snowy owls from all of these areas where they breed, extreme northern Alaska, Canadian Arctic, Greenland, Arctic Scandinavia, Arctic Russia, and said, 300,000. And then in 2011, Eugene Potapov and Richard Sale published a monograph on snowy owls that I highly recommend, in which they did a much more conservative estimate taking into account what we know about nomadic behavior, and they lowered the population estimate by an order of magnitude from about 300,000 snowy owls worldwide to about 30,000 snowy owls worldwide. Now, that does not mean the population declined, and unfortunately, it has often been interpreted that way. We actually don't know what the population trend for snowy owls is right now. I suspect most of us believe that it's a declining trend, but we don't know. And fortunately, Dr. Rebecca McCabe, who is part of our Project SNOWstorm team, just finished her PhD at McGill University working on using a lot of our snowy owl data. In fact, she's the one who did a lot of that airport relocation work analysis. Becca is doing a postdoc right now at Hawk Mountain Sanctuary in Pennsylvania, and she is doing the first global population trend assessment of snowy owls, and that's being partly funded through Project SNOWstorm. So that's another, if you're a Project SNOWstorm donor, that's another really cool place that your money is going. So we're hoping that later this year, early next year, we'll have a pretty rigorous sense of how snowy owl populations are doing in different parts of their global range. I will say that we know that snowy owls are, well, I would argue, one of the 4 species at greatest and most immediate risk from climate change, along with walruses, polar bears, and ivory gulls, because they only breed successfully when lemming populations are at cyclical peaks, and lemming populations only peak cyclically across most of their Arctic range when they have deep, soft, fluffy, insulating snow cover, so they can start breeding in the middle of the winter down in that subnivean environment and be supercharged when springtime comes. And in places where winter precipitation and climate conditions have changed, like, for example, the Scandinavian Arctic, parts of Greenland, where winters have gotten warmer and wetter, and the snows have become denser and thicker and icier, with midwinter freezing events. Like, for example, in Arctic Scandinavia, there's records back in the 1920s of lemming cycles every 4 years, like a metronome. And in 1994, they just flatlined, and they remained flatlined ever since, except for 1 year when they spiked again. And basically, snowy owls stopped breeding in those parts of the old world Arctic, because it's not that the lemmings went away, they just weren't cycling. Same thing has happened in parts of Greenland starting in 1998. In parts of the Russian Arctic, the periodicity of the cycles has stretched out. Instead of every 3 to 5 years, now it's more like every 6 to 8 years. So the owls aren't breeding as frequently. In parts in Denver Holsteady area up in what used to be Barrow, Alaska, snowy owls really aren't breeding successfully up there much anymore at all. Now that's a place where lemmings never really cycled with any kind of regularity, but lemming numbers just seem generally to be down. And Denver's been studying them up there for 25, almost 30 years, and they're just not doing well. So I suspect that Rebecca's going to find that snowy owls are in trouble. But yeah, wow, that was a long answer for your question. I'm sorry.
No, and are you kidding me? That's perfect. And we might want to get Dr. Rebecca down here to give us a talk when she does figure out when she just come up with a conclusion.
Yeah.
We'd be thrilled to know some of those findings. And it makes me wonder if there's anyone studying lemmings the same way folks are studying snowy owls.
There are, and in fact, a lot of the work, Laval University has been working up in Bylot Island for years, studying not just snowy owls, but all of the aspects of that Arctic ecosystem. Snowy owls and Arctic foxes and caribou and lemmings and long-tailed Jaegers and all of them. And so they've got a really good data set. What's really interesting, the one part of the Arctic where conditions seem to be getting better for lemmings is in the eastern and central Canadian Arctic, where late winter and early spring have gotten significantly colder and snowier in recent years, which, if you're a Hudsonian godwit or a redneck phalarope that's just migrated back from South America and you're stuck there waiting for everything to open up so you can start to breed, that's not a good thing. But it's, there's been some evidence from folks working up in that area, especially Canadian mammalogists, that conditions for lemmings are getting great up there, and it may explain some of the big numbers that we've seen in snowy owls in recent decades.
Okay. Amazing. I've got quite a few questions here, so I want to get.
Yeah, please.
One of them is a lightning round. So there's 6 questions in one. So Peter Langball says, I could not think of a better way to pose this question about open water hunting process except with a 6-part question. The duck is plucked off of open water. True or false?
Yes.
The prey is carried to shore or to a perch. True or false?
Yes. Obviously
The
true.
owl, the owl tears the duck into chunks to swallow. True or false?
True.
The owl plucks the feathers first.
Very big. No.
No plucking.
Table manners.
If not, the owl spits up the feathers in pellets.
Yes, but not just the feathers. I mean, like I've seen snowy owl pellets that included the entire leg of a redneck loon. That's gotta hurt coming back up again. So yeah, not just just barely small enough so that they can force it down their throat. They just.
And so the part 6 was most owls don't tear up their prey, so they really just like they're just eating as much as they can.
It depends on the prey. I mean, snowy owls, if they can swallow it whole, like a lemming or something, they will. So, vole or a small mammal or something. But I mean, they'll take birds up to the size of snow geese and great blue herons, and they will catch birds as small and agile as snow buntings and horned larks. I had a snowy owl I trapped in Pennsylvania some years ago that I put a transmitter on that was feeding mostly on small field birds, and like it was roosting in a Mennonite cemetery in southeastern Pennsylvania among all of these 18th, early 19th century tombstones. It was just bits of robins and hornlarks and Lapland longspurs and snow buntings and pipits just everywhere there, and the pellets were just nothing but feathers.
Wow.
You got to be a fast bird to catch those birds. And I watched that bird pick off pipits out of the air. I mean, they can hunt like falcons.
Wow.
In fact, Norman Smith in Massachusetts used to say the only bird a snowy owl can't catch is a peregrine. And then he sent me a picture of a snowy owl mantling a juvenile peregrine. He said, well, guess I was wrong.
Oh my gosh.
And what happened was, because he saw this happen, he watched it happen. It was a young peregrine, and it started chasing a shorebird. I can't remember what the shorebird was. And the peregrine and the shorebird went past the snowy, and the snowy slid in behind the peregrine, waited for the peregrine to make the kill, and then came down and grabbed the peregrine. So he got dinner and dessert.
Incredible.
Birds.
Okay, so this 2-part question follows that. What's the average wingspan of a snowy owl, and what's the average lifespan of a snowy owl?
Boy, and I'm not going to do centimeters. I'm sorry. Average wingspan's about 4.5 feet, up to 5. They're pretty big birds. I mean, of course, the females are significantly bigger than the males. The oldest, so far as the last time I checked, the oldest wild snowy owl was about 19 years. But the thing is, we really have, until recently, the very little return encounter information for snowy owls. There really weren't that many snowy owls banded until fairly recently. A lot of them that were banded back in the 1960s. Fran Hammerstrom in Wisconsin had a crew, they called it Operation Snowy, where they were trying to trap and band as many snowy owls as possible. There's been a fair bit of work done in Ontario in recent years, but I think my guess is that the average snowy owl is probably living about 10 or 12 years. They don't start breeding until at least 3 or 4 years old. Maybe in their second year with some females. The males almost certainly don't breed before about 3 or 4 years. So it takes them a while to mature. So there's no sense in them burning themselves out too quickly.
Sure, and maybe you mentioned this and I didn't hear it, but when is the breeding season for snowy owls? We saw our first round here in December, and they're still being seen somewhat. So yeah, when does that season start and end?
Well, one of the things that we see really clearly with our tracking data is the adults are out of here early.
Right.
And their departure date, it really depends a bit on weather. If we get an unusually warm spring with a lot of warm weather in early March, they'll depart early. But I mean, a lot of our adults are out of here by the middle to the end of March, kind of at the latest. And the males in particular, because they got to get back up north and find a territory. Now, how do they know where to go? Because they somehow figure out where the lemmings are. And, how do they decide that, this year I'm going to nest in northern Quebec in the Angava, and next year I'm going to go as far to the northwest as I can into the Arctic archipelago before where the next land is Russia. We have no idea. My good friend J.F. Therian, who did his PhD work at Laval on snowies, who's at Hawk Mountain, part of Project SNOWstorm, he only half jokingly says they smell them on the wind. Frankly, that would not surprise me. But we've actually looked at some of our migration data to see whether these birds are prospecting along the way as they're moving north, to see if they're trying to find places where there are lemmings, and they don't seem to be doing that kind of prospecting behavior. They just kind of zero in on where they're gonna nest. So the males get there while there's still snow on the ground. They find a territory. They start hooting and displaying and trying to attract the attention of a female. There's no pair fidelity from year to year. It's wham bam, thank you ma'am, on to the next mate the next year. They're up there by about the time the snow melts, they're ready to go. The
So this
juveniles,
question from
some of them will stick around, and we have juveniles in New England almost every year, that one or two that will over summer down here. So
wow. This question from Lou is kind of off that point. You said that food was built up in the nest so the female could keep laying eggs. Can she control the number she lays?
I would think so. I think it's probably, they're not a totally indeterminate layer like chickens, where if you just keep taking an egg, they'll just keep laying an egg. Flickers are like that too. I mean, somebody years ago did an experiment with flickers where they kept removing a flicker egg, and the flicker laid 158 eggs. I don't think snowy owls would do that, but if they're in better physical condition, if the female is well fed, and I think kind of physiologically sees that there's a lot of prey, and there's an abundance of food, that their body is going to produce more. I don't think it's a conscious decision that she says like, well, I think I'm going to do 9 this year. I always wanted a big family. I think it's a physiological response to being in super, super good condition. And, the thing is, when lemming populations are at their peak, it is just dead easy for a male to keep the nest provisioned without breaking a sweat. As far as I know, there's only one case of a male snowy owl with a polygynous setup where he had 2 females that he'd mated with, and he was provisioning 2 nests. So I forget what the total was like. He was feeding like 2 females and 16 chicks or something ridiculous like that, and he still slept 19 hours a day, because there was so much food at the lemming peak that it was simple for him to hunt. Wow,
amazing. Kay wants to know: are more female snowy owl coming down than male?
Can't tell you. So, for one thing, I think birders grossly overestimate how easy it is to age and sex snowy owls not in the hand. The standard males are paler than females and juveniles are paler than adults doesn't really hold up in real life when you get the bird in the hand and you can look at the molt sequence and actually measure the bird and or do a laparoscopy if you want to and see if it for sure is a male or a female. We do know, and we've seen this with, I mentioned that we used photo ID where we're, if you have a spread wing and tail from the back, a nice clear shot, you can age the bird because you can see whether there are different generations of feathers that would tell you if it's an adult or if they're all nice, even juvenile feathers. And in juvenile birds or birds that still retain their juvenile middle secondaries, you can distinguish males and females by barring on females and spots on males, and exactly what constitutes each is a little bit complicated. There's a good paper by Seidensticker, one of Denver Holt's students that laid that out. Anyway, long story short, we were able to age and sex all, a couple thousand snowy owls that were photographed. And in keeping with work that was done based on specimen records in the 1980s, it does look like adult females winter farthest north, followed by adult males. Adult females are bigger and socially dominant. Adult males come next, followed by juvenile females, followed by juvenile males. Now, that's not to say juvenile females never go south. There was a juvenile female that wound up dead on the Tennessee-Alabama border this winter. But by and large, in places like Pennsylvania, where I used to live, the majority of the snowy owls we see are going to be juvenile males down there, down on the Chesapeake Bay or the eastern shore of Maryland. But it depends. I mean, they are individuals, and so we'll get more of them. We'll get more of, sometimes more of one and more of the other a little farther south.
Interesting. And so the next couple questions are more of the data tracking. So that was more general snowy owls. So John wants to know, is there tracking data from snowy owls wintering in the Arctic Ocean that is comparable to hunting patterns when Erie was mostly frozen? Is the training on the southern lakes a hypothesis or backed up by similar tracking in northern wintering owls?
It is backed up. And so the training hypothesis is just speculation on my point that's like some sort of practice session for them. Maybe it's just accidental, but there is definitely tracking data that these birds are wintering on Arctic sea ice near polynyas, because the polynyas are really stable from year to year, and the locations of those polynyas are known. And my understanding is, until fairly recently, it was not realized that large numbers of sea ducks, especially eiders and alcids, some of them are wintering in those polynyas. But that was some work that was done, by J.F. Therian and some of his colleagues at Laval. So yeah, there's solid evidence on that.
Cool. So hopefully that answers your question, Sean. Thanks for asking. Peter Tome, who so here we have the Owl Foundation that has existed in this region for decades. And,
wonderful organization.
Yes, and so Peter has been doing some work with them for a few years, and he wanted to share that a few years ago, someone recovered a snowy owl that had flown over a sewage treatment plant's gas flare and burnt out a large crescent shape out of its wing, crashed to the ground. The Owl Foundation tried to rehab it, but it died a couple days later.
Yeah, that's a significant problem at landfills where they have methane vents that periodically flare off methane. So you have these grass-covered landfills with perches all around, and red-tailed hawks and snowy owls and kestrels and other birds land on them, and all of a sudden, whoosh, there's this flare of methane gas being burned off. And I've seen some of these birds with like all of their flight feathers and tail, all the feathers have been burned down to the quill. And not surprisingly, the birds also suffered pretty serious burns. There was a snowy owl that showed up that first winter of Project SNOWstorm in 2013, 2014, in the middle of Washington, D.C. It was perched on the Washington Post newspaper office building, and it was hit by a bus. And when it was recovered, the animal rescue group said, "Oh, look at this! This poor bird was burned by the radiator of the bus." No, the middle portion of one wing, all of the feathers had been flared off. It had obviously been hit by one of these methane flares at a landfill, probably somewhere outside of DC. And the rehabbers, it eventually ended up at the God, I'm drawing a blank. It's the big raptor trust in Minnesota near Duluth. And they actually had to replace all of the wing feathers using an old falconry technique called imping, where they cut away the damaged portion of the feather and take an undamaged feather, from a dead snowy owl, and have a sliver of bamboo with glue in it, and they slide that into the damaged quill. They were able to replace all of those feathers and eventually release the bird, who ended up getting hit by a car.
I was going to say, did it fly back into a methane plume? Oh, geez.
But that's
So
that's
Peter,
actually that's a significant problem for all raptors, unfortunately.
sure. So his question, so that was his comment. His question was, do you ever recover trackers from deceased, long
Yes.
lost birds?
Yeah, we do. We get a bunch of them. Actually, one of our birds that was trapped and tagged at the Montreal airport this year, actually the very first bird we tagged this winter, was moved about 80 kilometers. It flew back to the airport and was killed by the backblast from the jet. I mean, a lot of times these owls at airports are hit not by the plane, but by the blast coming out the back of the taxiing jet. And we were able to recover the transmitter, and they just redeployed that transmitter last week on another bird. We've had birds. We had a bird we called Buckeye that had been tagged originally at the Detroit airport, was moved down to Ohio. Its transmitter failed. It came back a couple of years later. We retrapped it, put a new transmitter on it. Healthy, experienced adult bird. When it was heading north, it was just north of Georgian Bay, and it went stationary. And a Ministry of the Environment employee very kindly snowshoed in to try to recover the bird at the location. And it was, unfortunately, by that point, it had been scavenged. We were never able to figure out what happened to it. But the strangest one of all, we had a bird that was tagged in Wisconsin a couple of years ago. And it was a bird we called Badger, and it was flying north in the springtime over Lake Huron near the Straits of Mackinac, and it disappeared. Just went off the grid. We never knew what happened to it. Last summer, I got an email from a guy in the UP of Michigan who said, "I found a white box with your name on it." Well, what he found was Badger's transmitter, and he found it tangled up. That the harness was still intact. This white Spectra harness that we use was still intact. It was tangled up in a bush right at the edge of the lake, and you can't really see this, but this thing tumbled in Lake Michigan's waters for about 2.5 years. Wow! So it's ground kind of like a river pebble. But as soon as he put it, in under bright light, it started working again. So man, they take a licking and they keep on ticking. So yeah, we've recovered a lot of birds that I'd say out of the 106 birds we've tagged, probably about, I should go back and check this, probably about 12 or 13 that we know of died. We have a lot of birds just disappear, and we never know what happened to them. We've had birds that have been hit by planes. We've had birds that were hit by cars. Actually, it's might be closer to 18 birds that we've lost. Had one hit by a snowplow. We've had birds that were electrocuted. A couple of birds that were electrocuted, in fact. We've had some that were simply found dead, and by the time we were able to recover the carcass, we were not able to determine what happened to them. There was one at a huge gold mine at Malartic in Quebec that, it was lingering through June and hadn't been moving much. I kind of suspect it probably got a poisoned rat. We have also had birds that died from rodenticide poisoning. So, just kind of the general mix of the threats that these birds face when they come down here. And it's always a shame when we lose one. It hurts. These birds become individuals to us, but we get good information from them. And often we are able to, if we're able to recover the bird quickly enough, we're able to necropsy them and get kind of a baseline on how their health had changed from the time that they were originally caught.
Paul Riss tuned in near about the time where you gave him a shout out. And to your point there, you had said a tree is as foreign to a snowy owl as a jet is. And kind of the amount of threats they face when they come down here is insane. That was such a powerful line.
Well, I think we have to remember how strange this environment must be for them. I mean, on the other hand, I guess maybe I mean the built environment, the human environment. I mean, snowy owls have been coming south from the Arctic ever since the ice sheets left, and they've been able to, been able to move up into the Arctic to breed. I'm sure for a black-throated green warbler leaving southern Ontario and showing up for the first time in Mexico, maybe that's unusual and alien to them. Maybe it just feels like home because that's where they're supposed to be. But an airport, snowy owls are not genetically wired for airports, so they just seem to accept it all with a great deal of aplomb.
Questions are still rolling in. Kelly wants to know where the largest population of snowy owls exists. Where are they? Where's the largest population? Do you know?
I would say in terms of percentage, probably eastern and central Canada, the Canadian Arctic. You've got about half the world's population of snowy owls, and the other half is shared between the US and Russia and Scandinavia and Greenland. So
cool.
But in terms of like where within Canada, it's shifting from year to year. I mean, some years the snowy owls are concentrated in this area and others in that. And I don't want to suggest that like all the snowy owls gather in one place and all breed there, because we have certainly seen with our track birds, some of them will wander around and never settle down. A bird that's bred 2 years in a row and raise chicks, it'll wander around the central Canadian Arctic and never settle down, never show any sign of breeding. Our assumption is it just never found a suitable mate, never found a place where there was enough food to support it. But it's still a little bit of speculation.
N Badger says there are a number of snowies that show up around the Lidwood, Macton, northwest of Waterloo, Ontario area. I have often wondered where they come from. Have you tracked any in the Hamilton, Guelph, any idea? So, the chances of you monitoring a bird that is overwintering around here is probably pretty slim.
We haven't had any birds that we haven't tagged any birds in that area. We haven't really done any tagging in Ontario, although we're hoping to change that starting next year, working with Charlotte England and Malcolm Wilson to get them on board and ready to start tagging some Ontario birds. But cool. And none of our birds have come down into that area that we've tagged in previous years.
Gotcha.
Speaking with the broadest of generalities, the birds that are wintering in that part of Ontario are for the most part coming from areas to the north up into the Ungava and up into Baffin and Bylot up into that areas. But Wells, who's in Quebec City again this year, I mean, some years she's nested more than 2,000 kilometers to the northwest, as far to the northwest as you can go before you hit ocean. In other years, she's nested in the northern Ungava. Just why they do this, how they figure out where they're going, if somebody can tell me, please don't keep it a secret.
So Dina is a two-parter here. She said that it was interesting to know that snowies eat horned larks. 3 weeks ago, I saw 2 snowies and 10 horned larks in close proximity. I wonder how many horned larks are left now.
But that could be a snowy owl that's like has no interest in birds and just eats mammals, because we really do see that where they can just become very specialized on certain foods.
So Dina wonders what percentage of snowy owls come back to the same location annually. So I know you had mentioned that there's a few.
Well, of course, a lot of it depends on age. We've really taken to primarily tagging adult snowy owls because the juvenile mortality rate is so high. And we really have found that first migration north in the spring is a really dangerous time for young snowies. We've lost a lot of young snowies in the spring migration. We do tag some juvenile birds that are airport relocation owls, because we're at the point now with the airport relocation project where we're testing different distances, different directions, different hold times, and so we have to be a little bit more. We can't be quite as fussy when it comes to whether it's an adult or a juvenile. But we've seen a lot of site faithfulness on the part of adult birds, but we've also had birds that Like, for example, we have a bird called otter, who this year is near the east end of Lake Abitibi, bird that was originally tagged in upstate New York. And he's one of our few owls that has a hybrid GSM Argo satellite unit on. So we can actually track him in the summertime. And, he came south this winter, but the previous 2 years he didn't. He just stayed up in the north. He was wandering around Baffin Island and down into the Ungava and just never came within cell range. So if there's any rule about snowy owls, is that there really is no rule about snowy owls. I mean, they have virtually every migratory strategy that it's possible to have. I mean, the Laval folks have shown that some snowy owls just don't migrate south at all. They just stay year after year up in the Arctic. As I said, some of them go north for the winter. Some of them are regularly migratory to very distinct, reliable winter territories. They're highly nomadic from one breeding season to the next. Some of them are somewhat nomadic from one wintering season to the next. Some of them do one thing one year and the other thing the next year. It's very frustrating when I'm talking to journalists and science writers that ask me to kind of, in a nutshell, how do snowy owls migrate? I said, okay, well, how much time do you have? Because they're fascinating birds to work with.
So maybe this might be an easy or hard question. What's the farthest south a snowy has gone?
The farthest ones I'm aware of, there was, during that big eruption a couple of years ago in 2013, there was a snowy owl in Jacksonville, Florida. That same year, there was a snowy owl in Bermuda. But the, holy crap, where did that come from record, I think, is the snowy owl that showed up in Hawaii. Showed up at the airport in Hawaii, where they almost immediately shot it as a hazard. Yes, I know, as a hazard to air travel. Almost certainly a bird coming out of Alaska or the Western Canadian Arctic. And oh my God, that's a long way to go across the ocean. But here's the thing. I mentioned all those snowy owls some years ago that were at Cape Race in Newfoundland. A lot of those owls apparently departed to the southeast out over the ocean. And in fact, that year, there were a lot of reports of snowy owls riding cargo ships across the North Atlantic to Amsterdam, for example. This winter, there were a number of snowy owls. I think there were 2 snowy owls in Spain. It was a first record for them that, again, almost certainly, in fact, in one case, I think they know the bird rode over on a cargo ship. And so the Europeans have been forced to reassess a lot of their snowy owl records in mainland Europe, which they had always assumed were Scandinavian birds coming south. But there's actually a pretty good correlation between the appearance of snowy owls in mainland Europe and big eruption years in North America. And these birds may have either flown across the North Atlantic or hitchhiked a ride on a cargo vessel.
That's incredible.
Yep, it's amazing stuff. And not just snowy owls. We know that ospreys have been known to do the same thing. My friend Rob Beauregard, who studied ospreys for years, some of his ospreys, he'd be tracking them as they're going south from Martha's Vineyard, flying across the Western Atlantic on their way to South America, and suddenly they stop and start moving directly east. And he's actually able to get the transponder number of the boat and get in touch with the captain. And say, oh yeah, there was this chicken hawk on our boat.
Technology.
Yep.
Technology. Wow. That's incredible. The last question was more about, can you talk about the nesting period, fledglings and juveniles, in terms of how long to hatch and then grow to the size, be able to fly and then migrate south? And that'll be the one of the last questions of the night.
Well, and I'm gonna punt on that one, because I have not spent any time with breeding snowy owls up in the Arctic, and I'd be kind of like racking my brains from what I wrote based on the literature in my Peterson Reference Guide to Owls. So I'm gonna punt on that one rather than try to make something up. So.
Well, and you know what? That actually segues into my last question for you: is what does 2022 look like for you? What's exciting you about the year to come? What can we expect, and what can you expect from yourself?
Well, I mean, we're probably winding down the snowy owl season now. We may get one more bird tagged. There's an adult male snowy owl at the Rochester airport that we're hoping to get a tag on. My good friend Tom McDonald's the trapper there. I've got some. I'm leaving on Friday for the Amazon. Taking a tour group down to the Peruvian Amazon with my wife, which will be a lot of fun. I'm hoping to get up to the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge with a shorebird research team in late May and early June. The big thing for me is I'm starting to work on a new book. I did a book that came out last year about global bird migration called A World on the Wing, and migratory birds are kind of in crisis these days. So I think it's an interesting book, but it's got a serious message. But I'm working on a new book now about what is working for birds around the world. What's working for bird conservation? What are people doing that are reversing the declines that we've all been seeing in bird populations? Migratory birds are in crisis. Birds in general are in crisis. It's easy to despair, but there's some really cool work that's being done out there by an amazing group of people all around the world, from indigenous communities to scientists to citizen conservationists, that are making a demonstrable difference on the ground for birds. And so for the next 2 years, I'm going to be doing a lot of international travel, working on that book, and hoping COVID doesn't get in the way too much. So
amazing. I can't wait to hear how that all went down. Good luck to you on that. And we had 85 people attend tonight. 57 are still in the room. What is your final, which is great. That means they're hanging on to everything you have to say. Your
people
message,
are gluttons for punishment.
your final message for Hamilton area birders. What can you leave us with?
Well, just to pick up on what I was just saying a minute ago, and this circles back to some of the things that you talked about in your introduction, Jackson, which is birds need every friend they can get right now. And so the fact that the birding community is finally, I think, reaching out to the community as a whole, people who aren't just, middle-class white people, to show them, to share with them, what amazing creatures birds are. If you have not made a friend for a bird this week, make it your duty to make a friend for a bird. Make a friend for birds. I'm sure everybody in this call does that. Be an evangelist for birds. Be a proselytizer. Cajole, badger, harass. Do whatever you have to do to get somebody to recognize what cool creatures birds are, and and get as many people into the fight as possible.
Amazing. Great. Well, with that, and 9:30, this is, I think, the longest we've gone. But yeah, and the thanks are rolling in. So on behalf of the Hamilton Nationalist Club, Scott, thank you so much for joining us tonight, for sharing your wisdom and expertise. Keep up the fantastic work. But yes, thank you so much.
Well, thank you. It's been such a pleasure, and I hadn't really been looking at the clock. I'm embarrassed that this has gone on so long, but
no,
it's been a ton of fun for me. Thank you all very, very much. Hope to see you soon.
All right. So thanks everyone for attending. We'll see you next week for Adam Schultz's presentation, or for the Bird Friendly Cities presentation next month. The Feminist Bird Club is presenting in April. Lots of good stuff, but most importantly, just go explore, go birding. All right, Scott, thank you. Thanks everyone.
Good night.
Take care. Good night. Hey, Michael, do you need to keep this open much longer? I guess we can stop it.
I'm getting a message on my screen. Do I want to stop recording to the cloud? And I thought I was recording on my computer.
Mhm.
Was somebody else recording as well? Does Lou record it?
You know what? It probably, when I first logged on at 7, it instantly started recording. I pressed pause. So that means when you started it, that it started from my pause. So I should have stopped it. I think I was worried that it wouldn't have saved. So it is saving to the, but I can give you the login information.
Okay, so I will press the stop recording button here. I might be able to get it from the cloud. I'm not sure, since I control it here. But I know the last time that this happened, Chris Motherwell had recorded it. So I don't know if he's still on the calls.
Looks like he might be, but if you press stop, save it to the cloud,